I'm a bit embarrassed because I've benefited so much by going close to last in this meeting, because I've heard so many wonderful things and so many great ideas, which I will shamelessly parrot while trying to ascribe them to the people who mentioned them. I think this has been a fantastic meeting. And when John first came and we talked about the doing something like the Macy conferences, I actually didn't really know what the Macy conferences were, so I went back and started to look at that, and it was really kind of remarkable how prescient the ideas seemed to be. And I couldn't really understand that, because, why was it that, all of a sudden we're now extremely worried and interested in AI and, in devices that mimic neural networks, and people were worried about back then, and yet for decades it didn't seem like people were that worried about this. And I think that you, Rod, made the point that, well, what happened was the digital revolution took off, Moore's law went ahead full steam, and anything that wasn't a von Neumann architecture just wasn't worth doing, because you would soon have a von Neumann machine that would be able to do anything that you could do. So people just actually rather stopped worrying about this for a while. Now, however, we're in quite a different era. And I do have some things I'd like to say about artificial intelligence and even about quantum machine learning, because John forced me to write about something that I work on scientifically right now. But I'd like to give a little perspective about Moore's law. This is from someone who actually, works trying to build computers where you store bits of information on individual atoms, and, on superconducting quantum computers, et cetera, and also with people who are trying to extend Moore's law further and further. So we're not at the end of Moore's law right now. But Moore's law has been, various aspects of it ended long ago. Most noticeably, the processor speed, which had been doubling every few years, crapped out at about 3 gigahertz around, 15 years ago, around 2003 or something like that, just simply so that, the devices wouldn't melt, which led to the development of multi-core systems, which are, primitive parallelism compared with Danny's connection machine, but nonetheless a form of parallelism. And now, as people are trying to press down to make the field effect transistors smaller and smaller, actually quantum mechanical tunneling effects are coming into play, and leakage current is growing, and you start to make these transistors smaller than 5 nanometers or so. And at that scale, you get also statistical fluctuations in the number of electrons on the transistor come into play. And the amount of noise that's going in the system grows. The wiring problem gets worse. And what's happening now is it's really clear that you can't just have more of the same. The Moore's law just making, von Neumann-like Intel processors is not going to keep going for that much longer. But what's happening is not that Moore's law is ending, but that actually it's fragmenting into a variety of different kinds of systems. So it now is a time when it starts making sense to make devices such as, people are already using GPUs to do lots of these neural network systems. Field programmable gate arrays are extremely useful for fast control systems. Neuromorphic computation is being explored, where you make systems that are more analog, if you like. I think I have to say a little bit about analog versus digital here, even though it's a very false dichotomy. As when John said he's going to make us all vote for analog or digital, and Danny said, "But that's so digital of you. You're like yeah." The systems, at bottom, nature is quantum mechanical, as Freeman pointed out, and quantum mechanics is both analog and digital. And once you operate at this very small scale, the digital nature of the universe is extremely important. So the kind of information processing that Caroline was talking about, information processing that's going on in the gut, this suggests a new set of apps to enlist your gut to compute for you, or like to enlist your gut to give you the gut feeling of whether this is a spiral galaxy or an elliptical galaxy. The stuff that. Well, it's important to note, and Neil pointed this out, that by far the largest amount of information processing going on in the human body is not in the brain. It's digital chemical information processing that's going on at the level of DNA and RNA, which is the ultimate digital form for information, because quantum mechanics makes nature digital. It gives you only a certain number of types of elementary particles, which combine to make only a certain number of types of atoms, which combine to make a large number but countable number of molecules. They can be in different places. Yeah, that's right. but somewhere billions of years ago, living systems figured out how to harness this very microscopic digital nature of nature into encoding information, genetic information into DNA and RNA, and into the receptor dynamics and the receptors in cells, which is all cells have receptor dynamics, and into the metabolisms of cells. So, as Neil pointed out, I think that you gave the number that if you look at what's going on in the genetic reproduction in the cell, okay, it takes about a second to bring in something, but they're 10 to the 18th of them, and 10 to the 18th operations per second. Whereas if you look at the brain, it's got 10 to the 11th neurons roughly, and 10 to the 15 synapses, and is going at 100 hertz. That's only 10 to the 17 operations per second. So. And these are very large numbers. And this has been going on for billions of years. Right? Neurons haven't been around for billions of years, but by God, cells have been, and been processing information very effectively, in a way that combines analog and digital methods. And this, I thought, I think, a wonderful insights for what happened came from Frank's talk, and I really actually agree with that. There is no singularity that's going to be taking place anytime soon. Ray Kurzweil was my neighbor in Wellesley, and he's a great guy. It is a pity that there aren't more West Coast kind of people here, because when I go out there, I find that large number of Silicon Valley billionaires seem to believe that the singularity is there, and that they themselves will be uploading their consciousness into a computer sometime in the near future. Though actually, if you just do the numbers, like how much is going on in the brain, how much computing power there is, and how much computing power there's likely to be soon, I think perhaps the only Sergey Brin is going to be the only cloud consciousness we have. I know, yeah, it's fine to, you say, okay, we want to upload one person, but when you start uploading the masses, and then the numbers just don't work out. Moreover, this is John was talking about the kind of, what happens if you don't read some well-known books. So, I suspect that if you uploaded yourself to the cloud, even if it were entirely successful and you found yourself as yourself on the cloud, but unable to go out for a cappuccino, you might feel that you'd struck a Faustian bargain by definition. And there's plenty of stories about people who desire to live forever and the technologies they use. And I don't ever remembering anyone that worked out well, unless maybe you count the New Testament. But
I had a conversation with a young man at Google at one point who was very keen on the singularity, and I said, one of the ways that we achieve immortality is by having close relationships with other people, by getting married, by having children. And he said that was too much trouble, like even having a girlfriend was so hard that he'd much rather try and upload himself into the cloud than actually have a girlfriend or have kids. That was much easier.
This reminds me of my course at MIT. I actually write the problems on the board, and they're not posted online. So if you want to get the problems for the problem sets, you either have to go to class or you have to make a friend. And I say, for you MIT students, you'll have to decide which is harder to do. Let me just say, class attendance is very good. So, no, my mother just died. It was very sad, and I'm still trying to understand that. But of course, that's the kind of immortality that's worth going for. And actually, not really the immortality of writing wonderful books or doing great science, even though that's also a good kind of immortality to strive for, because as you say, the important kind is the parts of yourself that you leave with the ones whom you love and who are important to you, that propagate maybe in good ways. This is what I loved about what Frank was saying, because I agree with this. I think that if you actually just look at these numbers for building new devices, and actually we are going to be building beautiful, wonderful, huge new devices that have vast amounts of information processing power, and I think in the not so distant future will in fact kind of match this roughly 10 to the 17th ops per second on something like 10 to the 15th bits. That's something that is likely to happen in the next half century or so. Though it's not going to be by a von Neumann architecture, it's going to have to be by a variety of different methods. And that then, for the reasons that were discussed by David in his talks about consciousness and that were emphasized in this by Rod and Danny and others, that people already treat the artificial intelligences of their life as very, very important companions that they would never be without. It's like who is more important, my cat or my phone? They just by becoming accustomed to treating these artificial intelligences, even if they're as dumbass as this little squeaky artificial mouse, and you respond to it as if it were alive, even if it doesn't meet any kind of criteria for having being able to perceive a gestalt, which is, as I mentioned before, this is one of the main issues that was brought up back in the Macy conferences, the early ones, about can an artificial intelligence have gestalt? Like, wow. Well, so even if we have something that doesn't, we know for sure it's not conscious, it doesn't have gestalt, it's like actually a very simple circuit, but we still feel for it and don't want to cause it pain. That kind of the socialization of intelligence, which we haven't talked about very much. We talked a lot about intelligence as being individual human things, yet the thing that really distinguishes humans from other animals is our possession of human language, which allows us to communicate, both to think and to communicate in ways that other animals don't appear to be able to, which gives us a cooperative power as a kind of global organism, which is, causing lots of trouble. If I were another species, I'd be pretty damn pissed off right now. But it's extremely effective, and what makes human beings effective is not their individual intelligences, though there are many very intelligent people in this room, but their intelligence that come from communicating with each other, their communal intelligence. And I actually believe that in fact, that my prediction would be that not going to be a singularity, but we're going to have devices that are more and more intelligent. We'll gradually incorporate them in our lives. We already are. And we and they will learn about ways to help each other, right? And I suspect that this actually is going to be pretty good. I think it's going to be, it's already the case when new information processing technologies are developed, then you can start using your mind for different things. So, for instance, when writing was developed, the original digital technology, well, then that put Homer and other people who'd memorize gigantic long poems out of a job. Actually, when printing was developed and texts were widely put out, then people complained that their skills that they had for memorizing, large amounts of things and poetry, which I think is actually still a wonderful thing to do, that, they didn't have to do it any longer. There's plenty of evidence that the way that people use people's memories, the way they use their memory, given that they have immediate access to internet search, changes a lot. And I know for myself, I'll just say that I no longer remember what it was, I just remember what I did to get it. Right? Where did I go? What were the search terms I used to find this, and then I can find it again. And let's not even mention the fact that nobody knows where the heck they're going in their head any longer, because they just have somebody saying, turn left at the next intersection. Right? So, this is going to be very interesting, and I actually think that if we think of artificial intelligence as part of the human communal development, then this is going to be very empowering for us and for these artificial intelligences. Which brings me to the bad news part of it, because I think I don't have much more time. The malign part, I have to remember to talk about quantum computing. But there's a lot of bad things out there. The fact that the vast largest amounts of artificial intelligence out there are being used by large corporations to sell us crap we don't need. So I sometimes question their intelligence. I've had both my hips replaced, and I frequently get these ads saying, "Dear Seth, you have this artificial hip. Perhaps you'd like to try this other one." Oh, and by the way, here's a Swiss Army knife for you to do it yourself. I mean, what are they thinking? Well, I don't get it. So, and not moreover, the questions of what they could do with that information, should they chose. If Google were more like the government of China, or if Google re-enters China and the government of China asks it to do things for the government of China, then essentially any hope of then we are in something that's much worse than 1984 and at some level. So I think that is stuff to worry about. But this notion was popular with Stephen Hawking, discussed it. Elon Musk is apparently afraid of this, that we'll create a malign artificial intelligence that will take over society, just seems to me kind of silly. I mean, first of all, we're far away from having such an artificial intelligence. A modicum of, we'll have a long time before, I would say centuries before such a thing might exist, and we have plenty of time to make sure that if such a thing exists, that it's okay. And actually, I think that one of the, reading is helpful for this. We know that if you create an artificial being who is both more intelligent and stronger and ethical than you, well, as Mary Shelley pointed out to us, you better not treat it as if it's subhuman, because if you do, then it will behave in a psychotic fashion. So I think that if we just simply choose to be kind to the artificial intelligences we create, we'll be going a long way in the right direction. And we should also be careful. We should be very careful about the companies that are spying on us and are using artificial intelligence so far primarily just to sell us useless crap over the internet. Let me close because I was supposed to say something about quantum machine learning, because that's what I said I'd say something about. Amongst these technologies that are likely to be useful, these novel technologies of information processing, are quantum computers, which, as Danny pointed out this morning at breakfast, and I completely agree, have not yet actually done anything that a classical computer couldn't do. However, are now at a stage where, despite the fact that they're still piddling and tiny, they now have 50 quantum bits, and 100 to 1,000 quantum bit quantum computers are likely to show up soon. These are going to be just one of these information processing tools, and they're now at the stage where they can actually process information for specialized problems like simulating other physical systems, an application proposed by Richard Feynman, that they can do better than classical supercomputers. That's going to keep on going. And interestingly, I should never say interestingly, because that means it's not. But about 6 or 7 years ago, my postdocs and I began looking at applying quantum information processing to do machine learning. And the simple intuition is that quantum systems can generate statistics that cannot be generated by any classical computer equipped with a random number generator. They can generate strange and counterintuitive phenomena. This has been known for more than a century. And we also know from the example of things like deep neural networks or Boltzmann machines or deep learning that if you build a device that can generate certain kinds of statistics, it can often be used to recognize similar kinds of patterns. So if quantum systems can generate patterns that cannot be generated classically, perhaps they can also recognize and categorize patterns that can't be categorized or recognized by a classical system. Moreover, it might not be that these might go beyond what you just have in a, what weirdness like the EPR effect and stuff like that. Might also be that they can find patterns in nature that for things that you could never do on a classical computer. And for example, what we first started out doing is actually exactly these k-means, quantum k-means, and quantum support vector machines, and then moving on to just bread and butter things like regression and principal component analysis, matrix completion, Netflix algorithm. These are methods that involve linear algebra, and a lot of learning techniques just involve, you take gigantic vectors of data and you multiply them by humongous matrices, and you apply some kind of nonlinear transformation, and then you do it again, and you try to train the system to work. Well, quantum systems, quantum mechanics is about humongous vectors in gigantic vector spaces and multiplying them by gigantic matrices, and then doing nonlinear things like measuring, and then seeing what happens. And it turns out that in fact, if you do encode data in a quantum mechanical state, you can actually kick serious machine learning ass. So, you can diagonalize the quantum computer to diagonalize it. Even with Google's 50-qubit superconducting quantum computer, you could at least in principle diagonalize a 10 to the 12th by 10 to the 12th matrix, something which would take Avogadro's number of operations ordinarily, and you're not going to do that classically for quite a while. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
So you touched on something which I actually went back and read because you had mentioned it in your earlier conversation. In the early Macy conference, I think it's in Ashby's discussion on the chess-playing computer, he sort of talks about an algorithmic chess player, but in his formulation, he also includes, besides a sort of a general purpose machine, he also includes a Geiger counter.
Right.
With degenerate randomness. So that, and he seems to think somehow that this is really important, but going back to kind of Allison's point, Bigelow says, well, it would work just as well without, I agree it's different with that, but why don't we just throw that away and it'll all work just as well, which is in fact kind of what happened. Yeah. And that was the truth. And they were correct that the machine with a true element of randomness was different than a classical machine. It just wasn't different in a way that was helpful.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Since you mentioned that, I also thought about that some more, about where does randomness play a role. So in living systems, well, neurons are quite noisy, and synapses are noisy because there's small numbers of chemicals. So neural functioning is quite noisy, and the kind of digital cellular level information processing is actually, in terms of genetic reproduction, is very precise. So E. coli, 9 out of 10 of the offspring of an E. coli as it divides have exactly the same DNA as the original E. coli. But of course, we know that it's useful to have stochastic processes. And in fact, if you stress the E. coli by putting in a bit of alcohol or something in their petri dish, then they start making many, many more mistakes because, they're in a bad genetic place and they better run away from there. Also, I think that something that Allison brought up, and this actually is related to what Neil was saying about, state-of-the-art machine learning algorithms. If you actually, and von Neumann, so, game theory, right? What is a Nash equilibrium? So for games, a Nash equilibrium, so Nash's beautiful theorem says, well, if you have a game, then there are actually these equilibria where both players can't change what they're doing without making things worse for themselves. But in order to achieve that, you need a probabilistic strategy. In order to apply the Kakutani fixed point theorem, you need a continuous space of strategies so that you can say, if I change my strategy, it's not going to work. And the best strategies then are these probabilistic strategies. And plenty of times, this is a very good thing to do.
But it doesn't require true randomness.
Pseudo-randomness would be fine.
Pseudo-randomness works just fine.
Yeah. Although there have been scientific applications where pseudo-random numbers ran into trouble.
Right, pseudo-randomness can be problematic. Yeah. Right. It's expensive computationally, and by definition, it is not random. So, if you happen to hit one of those non-randomnesses at the wrong time, it could cause you trouble.
Seth, what's your take, speaking of D-Wave?
D-Wave?
Yeah, but what's your take on the power of partially coherent quantum computers? So just to translate, quantum computers split into, the real true ones are maximally coherent, which means they can be completely entangled. And a lot of the things called quantum computers that have huge numbers of bits are only a little bit coherent. And there's a big debate about how useful they are.
So D-Wave is an example. It's not a full-blown quantum computer. It's It's what's called a quantum annealer. You encode the answer to a hard problem in the ground state of the system. If you can find the lowest energy state, then you've solved the problem, which is a classical method for doing this as well. And actually, as a result, they're much more immune to noise. The fact that they're rather incoherent.
So you start by putting it in the lowest state, or it
No,
goes to the lowest state?
The
lowest state is the answer.
The lowest state is the answer, right? So there's a classical form of this called simulated annealing, where you set up the logical constraints of your problem so that the energy is the number of violated logical constraints. And so the ground state, by definition, has the lowest energy because none of the constraints are violated. So it's a solution. And then you cool it down to try to find the answer.
But then another way to say these that's really beautiful is you put it in the answer, but you change the question. And so if you put it in the answer to an easy problem, you then deform it to asking a hard problem, and if you change it slowly enough, it stays in the answer.
That's the adiabatic.
No, so quantum annealing is based on actually what Neil just said. You started with a very easy thing to say, like all the bits, all the spins in your computer should be pointing this way, and then you gradually turn on this energy function that you wish to find the lowest energy state. And there's a theorem called the adiabatic theorem that says if you do this slowly enough, then you'll get there. And this notion of doing computation this way, quantum computation the way it was developed at MIT, but the design for the D-Wave system was developed by my graduate student Bill Kaminsky and me in 2002, and we failed to patent it because we did a little calculation, and we said, well, after you've entangled about 50 quantum bits, then no matter, even under the absolute most optimistic assumptions, then it's not going to work. The energy will be too high. And then D-Wave spent $100 million building this, from which I conclude that you should always patent things, even if you're absolutely sure that they're not going to work. So
but again, go back to
Working doesn't mean
whether you think there's power in partial coherence.
Yeah, so the D-Wave system is partially coherent. It actually does solve hard problems, and in fact, you can show that having a bunch of noise in the middle is helpful for it. It can very well be helpful for it to have noise in the middle. And there are plenty of kinds of computation, and including things that were developed by Shannon von Neumann, stochastic computing, which were not adopted. They were developed back in the 40s and 50s, but not adopted because of the power of rapidly increasing power of digital computers. And once you start actually pressing Moore's law, your systems are going to be noisy. They are going to be stochastic. They're going to be quantum mechanical, but they're going to be semi-quantum mechanical. They're going to be semi-coherent. And I think this is a wonderful opportunity to develop a theory and practice of these kinds of computers, which will be the most powerful computers that you could build, where you have to deal with noise and you have to deal with quantum mechanics.
On the singularity, the singularity idea that's always seemed interesting to me is not something about time frames. I mean, it's not going to happen in 20 or 30 years, I certainly agree, but I.J. Good's original argument that once you get there, whenever it happens, to the point where machines are at human-level capacities in a wide range of areas, one of the areas where they'll be at human-level capacity is creating artificial intelligences. And in the moment they get a little bit beyond human-level capacities, and they'll be a little bit beyond human-level capacities at creating AI, therefore they'll be able to create AI systems a bit better than those that we can create, therefore they'll be able to create AI systems a bit better than themselves, iterate until superintelligence. Yeah. And that's always struck me as a very, very promising argument. Do you think there's something wrong? There's something wrong with that?
What do you think, Fred?
No, some things can increase and reach and saturate a bound, or they can take off, or they can do something. They can slowly increase.
Even if it's only a 50-50 chance.
There's nothing inevitable about a singularity, and I think the structure of hard problems, P versus NP, suggests that there are going to be problems where progress will be very slow.
But why does it have to be inevitable to be interesting? I mean, this happens a lot in arguments about this. You don't know that's going to happen. Well, even if there's a 10% chance it's going to happen, that's incredibly interesting.
There's a sort of a flaw in it, in the description, which is it sort of suggests that intelligence is this unidimensional thing.
Yes.
Bingo.
You can make it work without that, though, and people have actually worked it out.
Something can be incredibly smart and not have the ability to make an even little bit smart machine.
Yeah, but you just
and so you're assuming like a particular. So that could happen in the some particular dimension of of intelligence could go off in that direction, but it would be a very
Once you
narrow
have
dimension of
correlations
intelligence.
between capacities, if one dimension goes off, then the things that correlate with will tend to go off. And if one of the things which goes off to infinity is the ability to create AI, then at the very least, you
It's
think
not
we
gonna go
get
off
get
to
this
infinity.
offshoot line that also ends
Yeah,
up doing
well,
it.
first of all, can we just do some numbers again? It's not going to go off to infinity, right? Computation is a physical process. Indeed, as a number of people in this room are fond of claiming that all of physical dynamics can be thought of as a computation, as information processing, and there's only a certain amount of information processing you can do. Now, those amounts are large. If you look at, if you're willing to kind of like turn things into black hole density and compute using black holes or something like that, but that's unlikely to happen. If you actually say, we're going to compute using things that have, electrons and ordinary materials that are held together by covalent bonds, then you're going to have basically ops operating at the level of an electron volt or something like that, and that's where nature is doing it already. So it's not going to become much more.
It's curious because, of course, if you think about it, we already do that, right? So we do know that the current intelligence that we have, one of its characteristics is that it creates intelligences that are actually superior to it on a regular basis, which in turn create intelligences that are superior to those intelligences. And it doesn't seem to bother us very much, presumably because, we die before we get to great-grandchildren. But that process is taking place.
You
And
might even be proud.
it doesn't strike anyone as being particularly maligned that we're creating generations that are capable of doing things that we're not capable of doing.
Every
right?
PhD advisor is trying to create an intelligence greater than theirs.
Disappointed when it goes in the other direction.
And in fact, literally succeeding, right? That's the whole plan of how human intelligence. That's the whole plan of human intelligence works. And it is interesting that it strikes us as being hopeful rather than striking us as being hopeful.
So I don't believe I'm going to defend Ray. But I find the problem really are his followers, not him. A lot of what Ray does actually is he projects data. And if you actually look at his data, Ray himself does a really good job. And if you just look at the data he projects, it's an interesting moment. The data projects in a really interesting way. So it's about singularity. But do look at Ray's data. The data is interesting.
So I talked with Ray about this, and actually, so there's been this old projection that it's been noted for at least 50 years that human population is growing super exponentially. That is, the rate of growth of people of the population is of course it's proportional to the number of people there, but there's another positive term that's proportional to the square of the number of people, which is the number of possible interactions you can have. And the way I make sense of this is exactly because we do have this funky universal human language, and because our intelligence is a communal intelligence, that our capacity comes from, it's not just for reproduce, it's not just how many people there are, it's how many interactions there are between people, and this gives you this proportion to the square. Now, if you integrate that, then you find that the population becomes infinite, and if you extrapolate from historical amounts of population, it becomes infinite at something like 2070. It becomes infinite in half a century or something like that. Luckily, it's slowed down recently. But so I agree with these. There are these kinds of trends towards singularity. So this was pointed out by some Russians like 50 or 60 years ago. Anyway. But of course,
people get stupider too. On the many axes of intelligence, there are many axes right now where people are instinctivifying themselves. That's stupid.
Well, I think
that's
one
like a
of the
massive failure of intelligence.
But I think we overemphasize as artificial intelligences get closer and closer to the capacities of human beings. They are already exhibiting, behaviors which are very human, like messing up in weird and unscrutable ways that we don't understand. Artificial intelligence often leads to real stupidity, and that's one of the signs that it's actually intelligent. Because human beings operate in this self-contradictory fashion, as we heard from we don't do things rationally, and by God, we shouldn't do things rationally, as you were arguing, and and computers are going to do that as well. And they're already deep neural networks are already being used to design, do programming and design the next generation of programming systems. This is not some science fiction. This is happening already.
Programming?
Well, okay, maybe this is this distinction that's come up a bunch of times about, what's the difference between a neural net that's been trained and a program that's been, written into memory.
Does anyone remember back in 1978 when I was computer hobbyist, 12 years old, there was a program that was released called The Last One. And it was going to be the program that wrote programs. And then once we got the program that wrote programs, we're never going to need another one. Okay, well, didn't quite work out.
So, I mean, as you realise, the main problem is you have to specify what the thing's going to do. But, with respect to this question about, ever-increasing intelligence and so on, it would be nice to hear from people what they imagine the definition of intelligence from some sort of physics, mathematics point of view might be, because I think it's all nonsense. And I think that the basic point is that, when you, in the end, you'll realise that intelligence is just computation, and you realise that computation happens in lots of kinds of systems. It happens in lots of systems in the universe. It's something where you say, we're going to have this ever-increasing intelligence. This doesn't make any sense. The universe is already computing in a very efficient, effective way in all kinds of different places. The question is whether this computation is aligned with something that we think of as being, human-like intelligent behavior, and that's a completely different question. And one that is quite separate from all these, singularity.
And the cash value is doing things that we care about, right? Like solving problems, curing diseases, winning wars.
Yeah, but I think this is a very good point that Stephen, as you know, Stephen and I have both written books claiming the universe is like a giant computer and that we should understand everything on top of it. I agree with you about this, right? We agree about this. And what's going on is that, when we're building computers, and particularly when we're building quantum computers, we're actually kind of hacking into the ongoing computation that's going on and having more of that be computation that we'd like to have. And when we build more powerful computers and use up much more energy, by the way, I think that computers are the real issues are not about use of flops, but about the use of joules and about energy that we're using. Those are the really hard ones. Then I think it's going to be okay, right? As I said, if we pay attention to the computers we're building, if we socialize them, we treat them nicely so they don't become psychotic, and they then are part of our human intelligence and not separate from it, in the same way that books are not separate from our intelligence.
I want to take your example of your hips and the advertisements for hip replacement, which you labeled as stupid. And let me give an account of why it's intelligent. You, I bet, know a lot more people that have had or will have hip replacements or on the verge of having them than I do. You are a social collector of people who are relevant to hip advertisers. So even though you won't need one, if you find on an ad, if you happen to notice, well, gee, that's better than what I got.
Right. Well, he doesn't want to be a node in capitalism's purchase of customers.
No, I'm just saying the capitalist system that's advertising hips to him is not stupid necessarily. And now the question, then where's the intelligence that discovers that you're a hip replacement node? Okay, and the answer might be, that it's an automated system already that tests a lot of different ways of focusing ads. And finds that people that have purchased something, for example, should still be advertised for the same thing, that even though, as in your case, you're not going to need another one, at least not for a long time. Right. Yeah. And so the system might have discovered that, with anybody designing it to discover that, because they try a whole bunch of stuff and some of it gets good feedback in terms of selling hips or cars or whatever it is. And so it's a combination, in this case, the intelligence, I think, could be accounted for as you're doing some of the work by collecting hip relevant people and talking to them when you learn something about hips. And the Google advertising system is also a learning that works. And so it's a combination of human social intelligence and the automated system. And it's a good example we've been talking about of how those are going to merge and complement each other.
It seems to me it's kind of poetic that we're close to the end and bringing together so many themes in terms of hip replacement. It does illustrate opacity. It illustrates looking at extreme cases, right? To try to Tell you new hips in case you need it. But it also
gets better. The reason I was energized to do this project, I went to get a cortisone shot. Nothing major, but it was for a pain in my neck, which means they have to do it in a hospital setting. So I make an appointment, hospital for special surgery, 3 p.m. Get a cup of coffee, come back, hit my email, New England Burial Society. I get a second email.
Are you
New
dead
England
yet?
Crematorium. Basket.com. Keep your remains intact for 1,000 years. Now, I knew this is very sophisticated because I knew that something was happening, and that something had to be deep learning, and I immediately thought of Demis, because I knew this is beyond Larry Page. Why? Because I made the appointment from my farm in Connecticut, and who knew that I don't do the boroughs? So I'm not going to the Brooklyn crematorium. Because that's where they are. They're in the Bronx or in Brooklyn.
Yeah. So
I skipped those.
So
they knew.
Yeah. But it also illustrates what's lacking, So it has opacity, it has looking at extreme cases. What it doesn't have is
Tact.
Empathy. It doesn't have a sense of decency.
Catherine
And I
Basin.
think that's what we need, is somehow to widen the circle of empathy on both sides.
Well, I think actually, tact, tact, which comes from the word to be silent, right? Is something we could really use. Herb Simon said, the world that is information rich is by necessity attention poor, which is kind of, he said this in 1956 or something like that. And so that really anticipated our current era. What we really need to do as human beings, is to protect our time and our attention, to pay attention to the things that are important, such as other human beings, and hey, the odd sexy AI.
Catherine Basin asks, why can't we have an AI with humility? Why can't we have an AI that asks a question and then says, maybe I better sleep on it?
Indeed.
Thank you, Seth.